film has been created to help you understand the role of replication as a method of understanding historic vessels. It'll explore the objectives of replication and how the construction of a replica vessel should be planned and implemented. In September 2021, National Historic Ships UK partnered with the Sutton Hoo Ships Company to host a webinar about their project to create a replica of the Anglo-Saxon ship, which was buried in the 7th century at the Sutton Hoo Royal Burial Ground. This film will explore the motivations, design, and skills behind the build. It'll give you a better understanding of the objectives influencing the Sutton Hoo replica build, sources of information that have informed the replica design, using digital technology to create an accurate design, sourcing and working with traditional materials and methods, challenges to a replica build such as funding or skills shortages. Replication has a valuable part to play in the conservation of our historic craft. Creating a replica can help us understand past technologies and techniques, where there are few or no surviving examples, and bring a vessel back to operation without the risk of compromising original material. The Sutton Hoo Ships Company was set up to create a permanent and authentic replica of the 7th century Anglo-Saxon ship found within the Sutton Hoo Royal Burial Grounds. Based at Wistock's boatyard on the River Deben, professionals, volunteers and enthusiasts are working together to gain a better understanding of the ship's design and construction methods. Built for operation, the replica will provide vital insight into how these ships were sailed and a unique glimpse into Anglo-Saxon life and culture.
Hello. Well, first of all, let's consider the motivation. Why should we want to build a reconstruction of the Sutton Hoo ship? In the first instance, it's big and it's elegant, so it cannot simply fail to be an impressive object. Also, it's very famous, and the 1939 discovery of the original remains is a whole story in itself, and was able to support a feature film, namely The Dig. Next slide. Now, if that wasn't enough, the treasure that the ship was found to contain adds further glamour, fascination and recognition. The ensemble of the ship and the treasure is far and away the outstanding tangible evidence that we have from early Anglo-Saxon England. Next slide. The gold buckle is a classic example of Germanic style to decoration from the medieval period. Next slide. The cloisonné jewellery is outstanding for the quality of its workmanship. Next slide. And of course we have the famous helmet, which truly justifies the word iconic. Now, less obviously, the Sutton Hoo ship provides a vital link in the maritime medieval history of Northwest Europe, where evidence is actually very scarce. Next slide. Sutton Hoo actually sits in a gap between two outstanding other finds, the Nudam ship and the Oseberg ship. Next slide. The Nudam ship, or Nudam boat as it's sometimes called, that was found in Denmark in South Jutland on the Baltic side of the peninsula and was built, they reckon, about 320 AD. It's pretty big, made of oak, 5 strakes on each side. It was rowed, it did not sail, and it has a comparatively V-shaped section. And then much later we have the Oseberg ship, Next slide. This shows a reconstruction of it. It was found in southern Norway, 800 AD, and as you can see, it is a classic Viking ship. It has a great big sail and a mast and actually sails rather well. And then next slide, we have the Sutton Hoo ship, which was found in Suffolk and dates about 600 AD, right smack in the middle. A reconstruction also gives plenty of opportunities for experimental archaeology, the chance to learn about early medieval skills and techniques. Next slide. This is an example of some work that we've done to investigate caulking. How do you sort of seal the join between planks, oak planks on a ship? Now, the most exciting aspect of it all probably is that it will actually do stuff. So we don't just end up with an object, we end up with a mechanism that enables us to investigate and explore the full capabilities of such a craft. And also, I'll just mention something else. Next slide. A half-size reconstruction of the ship was done in 1993 by Edwin Gifford. This generated a lot of interest in the maritime historical community, and this is an object we actually possess ourselves now, and this is it being rowed on the Deben. This was built really to try and explore the sailing potential of a hull which happened to be the shape of the Sutton Hoo ship. Now, it was been a long-standing aspiration to build a reconstruction, and among the people interested in this was Martin Carver, our chairman, who was also the last person to do any major archaeological work at Sutton Hoo. An effort to get a reconstruction going was made in the early 2000s in conjunction with the National Trust at Sutton Hoo, but this somehow ran into the sands, and I must admit I don't know the full details of that. But an opportunity did arise, next slide, with the redevelopment of the old Wistocks boatyard, which had become disused in the 1990s. This picture shows a picture of Woodbridge and the Deben. Sutton Hoo burial site is in fact just off the top of the picture, and the red outline shows where the redevelopment site actually was. A charity, the Woodbridge Riverside Trust, had been set up in 2003, pushing for the redevelopment of this site in such a way as to add to the community and the cultural life of Woodbridge. And they ensured that included in the redevelopment was a building we call the Long Shed. With the help of a generous donation, Woodbridge Riverside Trust also commissioned some drawings from the naval architect Paul Handley for a reconstruction of the ship, and these were published in December 2016. A separate charity, the Sutton Hoo Ships Company, was set up to do a major project in the Long Shed, which was simply the reconstruction of the ship. They published their roadmap in January 2017. They commissioned reports and drawings from Pat Tanner and Julian Whitewright. In 2018, the Woodbridge Riverside Trust were given a 35-year lease from Woodbridge Town Council on the Long Shed. Next slide. And this shows the Long Shed on the left, and this picture from April 2019 shows the launch of their first sizable project in the shed, which was actually the construction of a St. Ale skiff. Now just talk a little bit about the archaeological history. Next slide. Basically, the 1939 operation was a rescue mission, and it was mounted when all they'd found at that stage was just a part of the ship exposed by Basil Brown. The project was led by Charles Phillips on behalf of the British Museum and the government. He put together an ad hoc team who happened to be actually very effective and competent. A survey of the ship was actually planned from the outset, and Charles Phillips engaged the Science Museum to actually do the survey work. It was a lucky project in that, first of all, they had Basil Brown to do the initial excavation. He didn't muck things up. In fact, he did a very good job. Also, it didn't rain very much that summer, which was very good. And of course, they also found the treasure. But it was also unlucky in that the notes of all of the survey done by the Science Museum, stored in the Science Museum, got destroyed by bombs during the Second World War. All we have from that period is a couple of drawings. The whole ship was revisited in 1965-70 by the British Museum when it was actually a much degraded object to try and put together the final story. And they did lots of work at that time, and they also put together a publication in 1975, a massive tome. Lots was written about the archaeology and how to interpret it, but that record was not really written from the point of view of doing a reconstruction. So a lot of work was done by Sutton Hoo Ships Company in trying to pick over the bones of that and organise the information in a useful way. In October 2018, an international symposium was held in the Longshed. Next slide. Basically, presentations were made, workshops were held, scrutinising various hypotheses concerning the construction of the ship. The investigations that SHSC had done were exposed for comment. We got lots and lots of feedback, and we also got the names of the people who contributed to that feedback. The idea was not so much to have all the detail from people, but to know who to call when we wanted to pursue the matter further. Anyway, in the light of all this, and after much deliberation, we decided to go with the 2018 reconstruction drawings by Pat Tanner and Julian Whitewright. Next slide. This just shows an example of the way we captured the feedback from the symposium. Next slide. Just briefly on sources of funding. At the Longshed, we get a certain amount of passing trade, people looking in, peering in, and we ask them for money at the time. We give talks and presentations, and we charge for these. This brings in a steady trickle of money. Obviously, the other thing you do is you try and find generous donors. Sometimes the donors are happy to be associated with the project, sometimes they prefer to remain anonymous. A major source of funding is sponsorship, the funder fixing sponsorship, which is one of the first things you'll come to if you go to our website. This looks mainly at the various iron fixings, and for a certain charge you can become a sponsor of a fixing which will be identifiable and locatable within the final ship. It also includes the oars. We've had a crowdfunder project, and that raised about £12,000. We're quite happy to receive contributions in kind, in particular oak, for example, and obviously we're cultivating relationships with all sorts of landowners. There's also an organisation called the Institute for Digital Archaeology. You can look them up on the internet, and we've had useful cooperation with them, and they have contributed financially as well. And my final slide, just a couple of points. More generally, you need to keep up your PR, in particular including social media, because they will continue to give interest and help you to keep your money coming in. You will have friends for the project, you want to keep them engaged, and also it helps with attracting volunteers. The other point is that once you've got past the dreaming stage, you are actually burning fixed costs. You have got things like rent and insurance and heating and lighting, and of course staff costs, all burning away regardless of whether you're doing anything or not. So the incentive is to basically move as fast as you can. And I think probably that's as far as I want to go. Thank you very much, and move on to Julian.
Thanks, Joe. I hope you can all hear me. Apologies if you have any sounds of a toddler in the background. I've got a sick child in the house today who's a bit unhappy and happy, but all at the same time. So you might get a few strange noises coming through. So I'm just going to run through in sort of 10 minutes or so the process that we went through at the beginning of the project to come up with a design, I suppose, on which to base the reconstruction, or as I think the National Historic Ships kind of definition would be a hypothesis, I guess, of the archaeological and historical evidence. And in this case, what I suppose we're trying to get to, as Sean McGrail might have seen it, is a floating hypothesis eventually. Anyway, next slide, please. So Joe alluded to the original project design, which was created by Martin Carver, and that really has 4 stages to it. And happily, we are now on stage 2. I'm going to tell you a bit about stage 1 before Tim gives us a sort of a feel for what's happening in number 2, which was to design the ship, then move on to the construction of it, the testing of the ship, number 3, and then the completion of the publication and finding a good home for it. Anyway, next slide, please. So that first phase of it, the objectives that we set out in about 2017 or so, was to go through all of the existing material that we had. So to undertake a bit of a review of the data from 1939, the data from the 60s and the 70s, the work that Paul Handley had done, and to start with effectively to come up with basically just do some initial hydrostatic work to ensure that the thing that we thought we had from the various lines planned was something that would have floated and would have functioned as a ship or a boat's hull as we understand it, that we weren't essentially dealing with a ship shape that was created by the Anglo-Saxons purely for burying in the ground. And then, having done that, to go through and model as much of the archaeological evidence as we could find and we could extract from the various publication records to come up with the most, I suppose, complete reconstruction, as we would term it in archaeological senses, of what was found, and to try and understand that as best we could. And all of this was done with the huge input of Dr. Pat Tanner, who's based in Ireland, and who is very much an expert in the digital reconstruction of archaeological ships and boats. So all of this was done using a program called Rhino 3D, which some of you may have come across, and all of the testing was done with the Orca naval architecture plugin for that. Next slide, please. So Joe has alluded a little bit to the ship remains themselves. For those of you who are not that familiar with Sutton Hoo, it's a very big, it's a big open boat, really. I mean, it's called a ship because of the size of it. We'll not get into the difference between a ship and a boat today. We'll be here all afternoon probably. But you have a 27-metre long open vessel, 9 strakes per side, 4.5 metres in width. In terms of the original excavation, around 3,000 iron rivets, at 15-centimetre intervals. The concreted remains of one of those is seen in the centre of the screen there, and the sort of the imprints of the frames every nearly a metre or so. Now, there's none of the timber is surviving or was surviving in the archaeological site. The acidic soil of East Anglia kind of ate all of that. But what we have are the positions of the rivets that you can see in the 2 photographs there. The photo on the left is looking towards the bow of the ship, and you get a full idea of the impression that the ship's hull and the positions of those rivets has left in the soil. And then on the right hand side, a bit more detail looking towards the stern of the ship and the 3 frames quite high up in the run of the planking where probably the side rudder would have been. But you can also see from that quite clearly that the sort of the lines of those rivets connecting the clinker planks together still remain quite fair in terms of their runs. And then the frame impressions are there essentially when they were excavating the site, leading to a different coloration of the soil, basically. Next slide, please. What this has led us to, or left us rather, as Joe has discussed, is an archaeological record that is quite incomplete in terms of the material that we've got. The recording in 1939 was really well done, actually. I mean, I don't think they could have done it better. They were using the height of technology at the time, a very long piece of string, a frame in the middle, some tape measures, and effectively, in terms of the paper that was written up by Crossley about this, they recorded a survey station, if you like, at every frame, measured the rivets up the side of the frame to get the strakes, and then extrapolated the numbers of rivets to the next frame all the way along. So they ended up with a huge number of survey stations along the hull of the ship. Next slide, please. And as we can see, as I've sort of alluded to, this gives you a really good overview of the extent of the hull, actually. And I think with the archaeological remains, it's important to remember that in 1939 there was a huge amount of the hull of the ship surviving. On the left-hand side, just below the bit where it says British Museum in the image credit, you have the gunwale of the ship, and you can see the same thing on the right-hand side, just above the top line of rivets, where there's some darker sort of up and down vertical impressions, which are the gunwale spikes, which are holding the rowing thulls and gunwales onto the top of the planking. So we have the whole of the ship from side to side, and we have nearly the whole of the ends. And when the 1939 data was written up, they were very much aware that there was a tilt on the ship to one side, and it was a little bit down at one end in terms of how it was fitted into the burial mound. And all of that was rectified in the drawing that was left behind. Next slide, please. And that drawing is this wonderful, enormous set of plans that was produced in November 1939. If you could zoom in on the bottom right corner, you could see when that was signed off, which has an overview of how they saw things in terms of that three-dimensional data that was recorded. The bow and the stern planking in the plan look a bit strange, a bit like a duck's beak or a duck-billed platypus tail, because they couldn't really sort of work out how to rectify the way the planks had sagged out when the connecting nails had kind of, the stem posts had dried out and the planks had fallen away. So they left that. But it also has all of the information about the different details of the various fastenings and so on. So, as Joe said, although the original papers and dimensions and so on were lost, the plan that was produced kind of has everything on it that we would want archaeologically. Although if we'd had all the dimensional measurements, we'd probably have, plotted those again. Next slide, please. If we move on then to 1967, when the site was re-excavated, the British Museum team there was dealing with a much degraded site as a result of it being left open, well covered with bracken for 20 odd years, some tanks being driven up and down it. So they were missing several strakes off either side. They were missing a few meters from each end, and their recording system was essentially quite similar. Plumb bobs, spirit levels, tape measures, three-dimensional points. But the difference is we have all the data, but it's clearly not the same data that we had in 1939. So we kind of have two sides to our archaeological record. One is this 1939 set of material, which is fantastic data, but quite limited records to that plan and a couple of papers that Charles Phillips wrote, which I have to say are really, really good. And then the 1967 excavation and the 1975 publication, which is extensive, in-depth, detailed, exhaustive, but of a much degraded site in itself. Next slide, please. In terms of our reconstruction, what we basically went to do was to take this original material as far as we could and to always give that primacy over everything else. And only when we could not find an answer in the archaeological material to go and look at some of the sites Joe talked to, Osseberg or Needham, for some archaeological comparisons. And when we'd run out of archaeological comparisons, to go back and use Pat's knowledge as a shipwright to just, what would be a sensible thing to do from a traditional boat building or shipbuilding practice. Next slide, please. The first step in this, in Rhino 3D, was to plot out all of the nail positions, the three-dimensional positions from 1939, and then again from 1975 as they were published, and to go through a process of sort of comparing those, seeing where we had things that were missing, like the burial chamber area in the centre of the vessel where there's no data, some of the edges that were lost by 1967, and so on, and to begin to kind of assemble the three-dimensional nail pattern, if you like, of the ship. Next slide, please. That then allowed us to run a series of sort of virtual strake edges through those nails, which in turn picked up, I guess the best way to describe them is drafting errors, I think. And the photo, the screenshots on the right, you can see a couple of nails that are out of sync. In the middle picture, there's a whole line of them that are out of sync. And I think this is just an error of the drafting working at scale, you know, a 1 to 10 large scale plan, basically. I kind of like to think of some of those as the bits that got dotted on a Friday afternoon, probably, you know, with the stress of war and all of these things happening. So we found a few errors in the actual drafting out of things. Next slide, please. We were also able to rectify, as we saw it, a few errors in the actual shape of the ship. So in the top image, in A, you can see the original keel profile, in which the connections between the lower edge of the garboards, which are plotted as they were recorded, because the keel was never really properly sort of located in that area, don't actually plug into the keel, if you like. So the ship has a much longer, straighter keel than, as far as we can see in the archaeological material, it actually had in terms of what was recorded. So there was a certain amount of rectification of, again, a few more, I'm not sure if they're interpretive errors, but just errors that have crept in, basically. Next slide, please. That then allowed us to come up with a full sort of three-dimensional, full-size, on the computer screen at least, model of the ship, and to begin to do some work thinking about, I suppose, the shopping list for the project that would have to be acquired, but also to start working on some of the underlying sort of hydrostatics of things, to understand the weight of the ship, refine a few of the measurements and so on, and start to think of it in terms of people. Next slide, please. So as well as producing a revised sort of overall, I guess the minimal reconstruction, we would call it, because this is what we had the evidence for, and then fitting it out with some basic thwarts, thwart risers and so on, just to give it a bit of functionality, and to begin to put people into it, to understand, yeah, this was something that when it's finished and when it's launched, it will float. This is helpful for keeping the MCA happy. It's raised some quite important questions about the rowing of the ship and how you do that, which we haven't yet fully resolved. Next slide, please. Because one of the things it demonstrates is that actually to sort of sink the ship low enough in the water to enable the people rowing it to actually be able to reach the water with a sort of a sensibly lengthed oar of about 18 foot or so, maybe a little bit longer, requires a reasonable amount of ballast or weight in there. And it fulfills all of the sort of standard stability criteria at this point. Next slide, please. But what it sort of raises are that this is not perhaps the ship that everyone imagines it, which is the King's Taxi, which, you know, probably was the King's Taxi. But it's also quite a multifunctional vessel that, in terms of what everyone has thought about before, has about 5 tons of spare capacity. So it could have carried quite a lot of supplies, equipment, cargo. It could have been rowed quite effectively without anyone in the midships area, where there is no evidence for rowing tholes, but where the burial chamber was, and so on. It's allowed us, because we can run the sort of some basic resistance calculations as well, to understand a little bit about the maximum speeds of things. So all of that effectively served to sort of revise the original material, iron out a few of the errors in it, we think, understand the ship a bit better, and sort of hand over to Tim, if you go to the next slide, a bit of an understanding of what the ship would have resulted in. I mean, as an aside to the main project, it also allows us to produce these kind of animations, which are really helpful for trying to attract funders and sponsors and so on. Tim can correct this date now as well. I think that is all from me. So over to Tim.
Thanks, Julian. Yeah, it's an ongoing joke in the office at the moment about which spring she will be launched. But anyway, yeah, my role has been to take all of the previous work and put that into a system whereby we can actually build this great big clinker rowing boat. And when I joined the project in the middle of 2019, really there was nothing there. There were a few hand tools and a couple of very basic entry-level machine tools like a bandsaw. There wasn't a thicknesser, I don't think, or anything like that. Certainly no traditional tools like the bespoke axes which we've now had made. And so the first thing we had to do really was to get a cohort of volunteers and train them up to be able to build a clinker boat. And having said it's just a open clinker rowing boat, it's a very big open clinker rowing boat. And so the way we did it, the way we went about it was the first thing I did. We would need to actually find a way to build the thing. So I ran a 2-day seminar for folk in lofting, and we had a model maker who readily picked it up and 1 or 2 others who very readily picked the art of lofting up. And so we lofted the ship out at 1/5 scale, and the design cross sections at full scale, so that we could build these 2 models. On the left you've got the 1/5 scale model, which was what we have used to just double check all the areas of the minimum design drawing and to enable us to check that all the sections were fair and everything. There's no reason they shouldn't have been, but to loft the whole thing out full size would have been a massive task, and so I felt it was easier just to build something on a smaller scale. And this would then allow us to trial fit things like sole boards and thwarts and all the different parts of the ship which aren't shown on the drawings. We would be able to do it at a smaller level of investment. So we started building that, and we also started building a section of the middle part of the ship. It runs from exactly midships to what was effectively the forward end of the burial chamber. And this has 2 purposes again, well, 3 purposes really. It enables our volunteers to learn how to build a clinker boat, which I think only 1 had done anything like that before. It enabled us to actually look at the internal layout of the ship at full size, so we could trial sole heights, we could trial thwart positions, and really look at the biomechanics of rowing at a full scale level. And it also provided a virtual reality model, which was due to some of the animations that you've seen are based a little bit on this model. So that was the first thing to do, and then we had to tool up. We had to commission axes to be made. We actually bought some commercial traditional pattern axes. We've built the strongback, which is the black structure you can see here. Dr. Damien Goodburn was very informative for us about how the Saxons might have gone about building a ship of this size. And it also actually is the way the Danes have done it at the Viking Ship Museum in terms of building a strongback to build a ship on. So if I could have the next slide, please. Then comes the issue of sourcing timber. Timber is going to be the most expensive material for us unless we can find ways of sourcing it ourselves. So on the right, there's 2 pictures of a windfallen tree in the north of Ipswich, from which we can get some very useful pieces like the timber for the tholes, That's obviously where a branch has come out of the main trunk, and there the grain obviously goes both ways and produces a very strong part of the ship that we can pull the oars against. And the crook, you can see there's part of the same tree. And it just happened that with my pattern, I was able to show that that was exactly what we needed for the aftermost frame in the ship. The tree on the left was interesting. That's to Forestry England plantation near Swindon. And I'd gone there to look at a tree for a keel, potentially, which turned out to be the right one for us. And then I turned around, and about 30 meters away, there was this curved tree, which they really didn't know what to do. But for me, that was gold dust, because it had, the keel tree was 12.8 meters long, but the keel of the ship is about 18 meters long. So we need some extensions to the keel. And this curved tree was perfect, because the bottom part of it, I could get the extension for the keel, and the upper part of it, before the first major branch comes out, was perfect for the lower part of the stem. And all they had to do is cut it off where the curve changes, turn it through 180 degrees, and we've got a ready-made shape of the end of the keel and transition into the stem. So that's really how we went about it. We know from Forestry England that these two trees for the keel and the underlat, the extension, they were planted in 1820 specifically for shipbuilding materials. But in the time, so they were still thinking ahead about wooden shipbuilding in that period. Little did they know then that we'd be soon moving over to iron and steel ships. But this plantation has stood for 200 years, and we were able to take advantage of two trees from it. So if we had the next slide, please. So these are some of the tools we commissioned and made ourselves. On the left is an Anglo-Saxon pattern clamp, which you see there. It's clamping two pieces of planking together with the overlap in between. It's one big experimental archaeology project, and we found with that clamp that although it matched the Saxon pattern that we've got artifacts for, that actually isn't strong enough to hold two pieces of planking together as they curve in the shape of the ship. So we had to then develop that, and we've actually gone to a later medieval, early Viking pattern where there's a much bigger section to the clamps, to the arms, and also more of a curve for working around the curved areas of the ship. The axe you see on the right is made for us specially. We've got 4 of those now. It's single ground, it's a right-handed axe. The handle is offset from the blade so that you don't wrap your knuckles on the work all the time, and that's a finishing axe. That's for taking very fine finishing cuts off a piece of wood. And we found with that we can actually cut square across a section of timber very accurately, giving a very nice, neat finish. It's not the same as a modern mechanically planed finish, but it's nearly as good. If can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So having lofted the sections, we're then in a position to go to what probably recognised more as a modern tradition of making temporary moulds to keep the shape of the ship while we built it. Early on, realised that with a small pool of volunteers who we were still training up, we were going to need something to keep the shape of the ship while we built it. And whilst the Saxons wouldn't have used these, this seemed to be the best way to actually preserve the shape while we were planking the ship. So we made, both for the midships model and for the ship herself, we've made a set of moulds, which we then set up, and this would be recognisable to most boat builders today. This is how we would prepare to plank a ship. Next slide, please. Here we have some shots of the keel. On the left, it's just after we sawed it out of the log. For me at this stage, it was this is March this year. So we were in the middle of all these COVID lockdowns, and we were able to work in a barn off site. But I felt it was just too much of a risk to cleave this in the traditional manner out of a log. So we used a chainsaw mill to cut a blank for the keel. So that is 12.8 meters long, and it's 400 millimeters wide and about 150 mil thick, and weighs probably about 1,300 kilos. So we had to maneuver it onto a truck or trailer to get it down to the long shed. And we use these commercial engine hoists to do that, and they work very well. And having got it into the long shed, we were then able to work on it with axes to produce the finished keel, which you see on the right. So you can probably see the taper to the keel. Here we had long discussions about the keel and whether, as it was drawn in the minimum reconstruction, which basically showed only what was there in the archaeology. We had long discussions as to whether that was actually likely to be strong enough for the ship, and whether it followed the archaeology that we know in, for instance, the New Dam ship and some of the other poorly described early archaeological excavations of Saxon ships in Britain. So we eventually employed a tapered keel, and you can see the taper along the length of it. You can see the hollowed surface to the top of the keel. That's because we know from the nails that the roves on the diamond-shaped roves that held the planks together, they were actually parallel to the heads of the rivets. So rather than having a flat surface like a modern keel would, we knew it had to be curved as it moved towards the end of the ship. And you can also see the scarf there, and where it's been beveled to take the plank lands, and that is all axe finished. So we're using a combination really of modern techniques where we have to, and traditional techniques where it's possible. Next slide, please. Now, these are some of the really traditional techniques. This is the after underlaut. So this is a different piece to the one we saw before when it was standing in the tree. And you can see the chap on the right here is actually cutting out the surface of the log to get a flat. And the picture on the left shows the flat with the pattern on top of it. And so purely with axes, we can bring that round, irregular log to a square section, the correct profile of the end of the ship. And now we're actually working on that to fit the planking bevels. And as it goes up towards the stem, it's a rolling bevel. It becomes a very steep bevel and a deep hollow inside it to actually take account of these parallel lands to enable the roves to meet parallel with the heads of the nail. There's a lot of work here. It does take longer than using modern techniques, but it is very, very simple to do it and to make it work accurately. We can get square sections, we can get flat surfaces, and we can compare those with existing artifacts, for instance, again, the New Dam ship, and we can see that the tool markings that we're getting in there are comparable with the archaeology from 1600 years ago. So we know we're on the right track. Next slide, please. And this is where we're at now. So the keel you can now see is actually on the strong back, and we've begun to set up the molds for the ship. Right in the foreground, you might be able to see the blades of 3 oars, and behind the ship, sitting vertically on the horses, there are sections of planking which are being cleaved. So the second half of the keel log that remained after we'd taken the keel blank out of it, we then cleaved that into eighths, which is equivalent to 1/16 of the whole log, and then notched out the wedge-shaped surface and taken the waste off it, and we're now working those down with axes to the finish, which is 1 inch thickness. And then it's from there, it's exactly like building a ship using modern techniques, using dollies and hammers to nail the ship up. The only probable difference is we'll be trying to use traditional techniques where we can to cut the nails short after we put the rows over and things like that. But we're continually learning about it. You might see there's a bottle jack under the forward end of the keel there. The keel length and the locations of the different sections of the keel aren't fully understood from the archaeology, and we found there that actually that doesn't follow, although it's a scale length scarf as drawn from the archaeology. It doesn't really follow the curved section of the profile of the keel very well. So we're having to try and induce some bend in it before we put the extensions to the keel on. That might indicate that there's more than one joint in the keel somewhere, or that we've not got them in quite the right place. And we have a research team that's looking into that, as well as a recording team that's actually recording all this so that it can be looked at by archaeologists and researchers in future years, and it can all be published so that everybody can have access to what we've done and why we've done it and how we've done it.
Now you've watched this film, here are some tasks you can try. Look at National Historic Ships UK's replica definitions. You can find this in Chapter 8 of our textbook, Conserving Historic Vessels. Find examples of replica vessels and understand the motivations behind their build. Create a proposal for a replica build, including research, construction, and sources of funding. Research Maritime and Coast Guard Agency regulations to understand what's required of an operational replica vessel created to carry passengers. Armed with all this information, you can start work on your replica vessel.